The Wycliffe family believed their house could pray. Its walls, they said, could whisper psalms when no one else remained awake. But those prayers grew darker, and when the family finally vanished, the house continued the devotion on its own. Visitors would later swear, if you stood long enough in the halls, you could hear it praying for you by name. A stillness lies over the fields, like something held its breath long before the century began. The trees seem older here, not in age, but in posture. Their branches arch strangely, as though they lean away from a single point, a clearing in the woods where no house yet stands. The year is 1821. The land is unbroken, but it already has a reputation. Locals avoid it. Animals skirt its edges. Travelers, riding the rough-hewn wagon paths, quicken their pace as they pass. No one can say when it began, but they all know the story. The fields are quiet, too quiet. Bird song dies out when you cross the boundary. Cattle refuse to graze, even when driven by hunger. Some say the soil is sick. Others whisper it was once a burial ground, long before the English came. But the farmers of the surrounding county call it something simpler: the waiting land. It waited for decades, empty, unclaimed, too cheap to be ignored, too unsettling to be taken. But that changed in 1824. That was the year Reverend Elias Wycliffe arrived. He was not like the others. A tall man, lean, with eyes that seemed both searching and stubborn. A preacher's eyes, the kind that looked for meaning in everything, whether it was there or not. He had traveled south from Pennsylvania, where his sermons drew equal measures of admiration and suspicion. He spoke often of purity, of cleansing, of the need to separate holy ground from profane. By the time he reached Virginia, he carried with him both a small congregation and a great ambition. He wanted land, not for farming, not for profit, but for permanence, a place where the Wycliffe name could take root, where his vision could breathe, where his faith would not just be practiced, but enshrined. And so he looked upon the waiting land. Where others saw danger, he saw promise. Where others saw silence, he heard the whisper of opportunity. He called it sanctified soil. The words unsettled those who lived nearby. They had spent years convincing themselves the land was merely cursed. To call it sanctified was worse. It meant you thought you understood it. It meant you thought you could own it. Reverend Wycliffe paid almost nothing for the acreage. The seller, an aging farmer with shaking hands, was glad to see it go. But after the ink dried, he would not shake Elias Wycliffe's hand. He only muttered one thing under his breath as he folded the deed back into its pouch. "You won't stay." Elias smiled politely, but he did not answer. He rode out to the land the very next morning, his horse's hooves thudding against the clay road. The trees parted into the clearing, and for the first time, he stood in the stillness. And it was exactly as they said. The air hung heavy. The breeze seemed to curl away. Even the insects fell quiet, as if this place were sealed from a natural world. But Elias felt something else, a sense of destiny, of ground untouched, waiting for the right hands to shape it. He knelt, pressed his palm to the earth, and whispered a prayer. It was not a request. It was a claim. But something wasn't right. When he lifted his hand, his palm was wet with soil darker than it should have been. Too dark. Not mud, not damp with dew, but stained as if the earth itself had bled. He did not speak of it, not to his wife, not to the congregation. Instead, he called them together the following Sunday. Standing beneath the branches of a twisted oak, he announced his vision. They would build a home, a chapel, an estate that would stand as a testament to their endurance and their faith. Some hesitated. They had heard the rumors too. They had seen their horses buck at the edge of the clearing, refusing to go further. But Elias spoke with the weight of conviction. "This is not cursed ground," he declared. "This is ground waiting for holiness." And so they obeyed. They brought axes. They brought saws. They brought their children, their wives, their strength. The first tree fell in silence. No echo, no birds rising in alarm. Just a crack of wood and the heavy thud into soil that swallowed the sound whole. One of the men, Thomas Hale, later told his wife that the sound unnerved him more than anything. "It's like it didn't want to be heard," he said. Within a month, the foundation was laid. Logs notched and fitted. Stone dragged in from the riverbed a mile away. Elias worked harder than any of them, hauling timbers until his hands blistered and bled. He said the pain was holy, that suffering baptized the land. At night, they camped on the edge of clearing. No one would sleep within it yet. Around the fire, they whispered of odd things they noticed. Footsteps on the path when no one had passed. A strange pressure in the chest that grew worse the deeper one walked into soil. Children waking with nosebleeds. But Elias silenced them. He reminded them of Israel in the desert, of trials before promise, of devils that fled before the righteous. And yet, the unease grew. One boy refused to return after the second week. He would scream at his mother when she tried to lead him back to the site. "He's there," the boy cried, over and over again. "He's there." No one knew who he meant, but no one asked him again. When the walls of the first house finally rose, Elias Wycliffe gathered them once more. He told them they had done God's work, that the silence they felt was not emptiness, but waiting. "The land has longed for us," he said. "It has waited for this day." The congregation nodded, but behind their eyes there was hesitation. Some had already begun to think of leaving. Some had already packed quietly at night, wagons ready, should things grow worse. But Elias Wycliffe did not doubt. He carved a cross into the first beam of the house. He burned a psalm into the threshold stone. And when his wife asked him if he felt the land was safe, he looked her in the eyes and said, "It was never safe, but it is ours." And that was enough. The Wycliffe estate was born. But no one, not Elias, not his congregation, not the neighbors who kept their distance, could deny one thing. The land had changed. The silence was no longer still. It was listening, and it was only the beginning. The frame drifts across the ridgeline. Mist clings to the trees. A shape rises through it, broad, angular, unfinished in its edges. The Wycliffe Manor. It stood where the silence had gathered. A house and a chapel in one. Stone set against timber. Walls thick, high, and heavy, as though meant to hold something in, not out. From a distance, it looked almost like a church without a town. Tall windows. A central hall that carried the sound of voices upward. A spire that wasn't quite a steeple, but wasn't quite a tower either. It was built with purpose, with prayer in every joint, with scripture whispered into every crack of mortar. Elias Wycliffe believed the house should not only shelter the body, it should shelter the soul. He told his children they were to breathe faith into the walls, that every moment of silence was an opening, and silence could never be allowed to linger. So they whispered verses, psalms, fragments of sermons half remembered, even in the dim corridors where candles smoked and drafts curled against their necks. They whispered. At first, neighbors thought harmless, an oddity, another preacher's quirk. But in time, the story spread that if you stood outside the house at night, you could hear it, a constant murmur, like a hive, low and unbroken. But something wasn't right. Inside, the Wycliffe children grew pale. They walked with eyes lowered, their lips never still. They slept beside Bibles tucked under their pillows. And they were told that forgetting a verse, even for a breath, was an opening for temptation. The oldest boy, Nathaniel, was said to whisper even in his sleep, words spilling into the darkness as if someone were there to receive them. Visitors noticed. A mason who came to fit the hearthstone described the sound of children behind the walls. Though he only saw two standing in front of him, he left before the work was finished. And Elias only smiled. He called it discipline, devotion. He said his household would be a lamp in a valley of shadows. But the neighbors whispered back. They said it was something else. Fanaticism, obsession, a family drawn too far inward until they could no longer tell the difference between worship and warning. The house itself seemed to change, not in form but in feel. The longer it stood, the heavier it grew, as though each prayer sealed another layer of air inside, until stepping through the threshold felt like sinking beneath water. Even relatives avoided staying overnight. One cousin, sent to help with harvest, wrote in a letter that he woke in the night certain he was being watched, not from the doorway, not from the window, but from the walls themselves. He left before dawn. The Wycliffe children did not leave. They rose with Scripture. They worked with Scripture. They ate in silence, but for the muttering of psalms. Their play, what little they had, was reciting passages in competition to see who could last the longest without stumbling. When one child faltered, Elias struck the table and reminded them, "A silent tongue is a waiting devil." His wife, Margaret, tried to soften it, but her voice carried no weight beside his. Her eyes, tired and sunken, told the neighbors more than her words ever did. She, too, whispered, but hers was the whisper of resignation. And still, the house grew louder. At night, passing travelers wrote in their journals that the Wycliffe estate sounded like a congregation mid-sermon, voices weaving together, rising and falling. But when they paused to listen more closely, it was never clear if the words aligned. Some thought they heard chanting. Others insisted it was crying. But the one detail all agreed on was this: it never stopped. The land had once been silent. Now it was smothered with prayer. And yet, for all its noise, something hollow remained, like the sound was being pulled into ground. One farmhand, hired for threshing, swore that the very walls seemed to breathe, that when he leaned close, he felt warmth against the plaster, as if someone on the other side exhaled directly into his ear. He never returned. And that's when the suspicions grew darker. If prayer was constant, who were the Wycliffes speaking to? Neighbors began to cross the road rather than walk past the estate. Children made signs of protection when they saw Nathaniel or his sisters on the lane. The family was not shunned outright. Elias was still a preacher, still a man of Scripture, but their faith had taken on a shape few could recognize. Inside, the children aged strangely. They grew tall before they grew strong. Their voices deepened, but their eyes remained wide and vacant. They spoke to each other in fragments, half-formed verses braided together until meaning was lost. Margaret's health declined. She coughed into rags she tried to hide. But the whispers continued, even from her bed, especially from her bed. One neighbor swore he saw her at the window one night, lips moving though the candles were out, her eyes fixed on nothing, her mouth working ceaselessly. When Elias was asked about her, he only answered, "She prays without ceasing, as we all must." And so the house was sealed. No laughter, no music, no rest, only a family bound in constant murmur, their walls saturated with Scripture until the sound seemed to take on a life of its own. Travelers noted that their horses balked near the estate, hooves striking the dirt as if it burned them. Dogs howled at the edge of the clearing, but would not step closer. And in time, even the locals stopped trying to explain it. They had another word for the Wycliffes now. Not preachers, not settlers, not even neighbors. Fanatics. The land had waited. The house had risen. And now the voices filled it hour after hour, day after day. But beneath it all, something remained. Something unspoken. Something that no amount of Scripture could conceal. Because when the neighbors passed at night, and the windows glowed faintly with lamplight, the murmurs seemed too many, more than the Wycliffe family could produce, more than the walls should be able to hold. And though no one said it aloud, they all began to wonder the same thing. If the Wycliffes were whispering Scripture into the walls, what was whispering back? The frame drifts along the length of the manor. Its windows are dark, the trees pressing around it, leaning, as though straining to listen. Inside, the silence feels heavy. Too heavy, but it does not stay silent for long. By the late 1820s, the Wycliffe household had gained a reputation, not only for their endless prayers, not only for the murmurs that slipped through the walls, but for something else, the sound of music. Visitors told the same story again and again, that as night fell and the fires dimmed in the hearth, the house itself began to hum, not loudly, not clearly, but faintly, like stone remembering a song. At first, guests tried to explain it. Old timbers settling, wind caught in the eaves, the echo of someone whispering in the next room, but the notes followed them. into the hallways, up the stairs, even into their beds. The Wycliffes offered no apology. Elias explained it as though it were obvious. The house retains prayer, he said, like water soaking into wood, like oil pressed into cloth. Every hymn we raise is caught in the walls, and the walls release it in their own time. He spoke it calmly, with the kind of certainty only he could carry. But something wasn't right. The tones were not always tones a human throat could match. They slid between keys. They deepened beyond a man's voice. They rose sharper than any woman's song. Guests left uneasy. They said the hymns clung to them, that their ears still rang with it after they crossed the threshold back into daylight. One merchant who stayed for a night swore he heard a chorus while sitting alone in the dining hall. The voices drifted above him, filling the rafters. But when he looked up, nothing, only beams and shadows. He rode away before dawn, and that's when he heard it. As his horse carried him past the edge of the clearing, the faintest echo trailed after him, the same tune rising and falling behind him like breath. It was not carried on the wind, it was carried from the house. The neighbors tried not to believe it, but more visitors repeated the same. Even the children of nearby farms claimed they heard it when the night was still. The faint ring of voices threading through the trees. The Wycliffes themselves seemed unbothered, even proud. Margaret, pale now from years of exhaustion, told one woman that it was proof that their devotion had soaked the stone so deeply it could not be erased. But others wondered if something else was speaking back. Nathaniel, the eldest, told a cousin in confidence that he often woke at night to hear a voice singing beside his bed. When he opened his eyes, there was nothing, only the rhythm of the walls. He asked his father if the stones themselves could pray. Elias did not answer. Instead, he told him to pray louder. The unease spread. Travelers avoided the manor unless forced. Neighbors no longer lingered at the gate. The hymns had become more than a curiosity. They were a warning. One guest, a schoolteacher from Richmond, recorded what she heard. She marked the notes carefully, and when she compared them later to the hymnals she carried, she realized the tune did not match any known psalm. It rose and fell in ways no choir would ever write. The lines tangled into themselves, like words half-forgotten, like scripture misremembered in fever. And yet, it was unmistakably a hymn. Her hand shook as she wrote in her journal that night. The house sings what no man taught it, and the voices it holds are not all their own. She never returned. Still, the Wycliffes pressed on. They filled the manor with ceaseless prayer, certain it was sanctified. They explained away every noise, every echo, every shifting note in the air. But those who heard it knew. The sound was not remembrance. It was repetition. The house was not holding prayers. It was learning them. And though no one would admit it aloud, the hymns did not always sound grateful. They sounded hungry. The frame lingers on the windows of the manor. Dark glass, curtains drawn, the air around it pressed flat, as though the house itself held its breath. By the early 1830s, something had shifted inside the Wycliffe estate. The neighbors knew it first. The smoke from the chimney grew thinner. The family was rarely seen. And when they were, their faces had grown lean. The records tell us sickness struck the household. But no doctor was ever called. Not once. Instead, the rituals deepened. The prayers, which had once filled the halls like a river of whispers, became harsher, more urgent. No longer gentle pleadings for mercy, but sharp invocations. They were not asking. They were demanding. Visitors described it with unease. The cadence was wrong. Not humble, not bowed in spirit, but upright, commanding. One servant who left the estate later told a magistrate it was like listening to hunger with words. But something wasn't right. The doors that had once been left ajar were sealed, windows nailed shut. The air inside grew stagnant, heavy with the smell of wax and tallow smoke. And on the walls, scripture, not framed, not written on parchment, but painted, layer after layer, black strokes over plaster, red across the beams, whole psalms circling the door frames. The servants were made to help. They held the brushes. They scrubbed the ink into the stone until it bled into the grain. Some refused, and they were dismissed. Others obeyed, and spoke later of a strange dizziness that overcame them as the work went on, like the very words they painted pressed back against them. The sickness did not relent. Children fell weak. Margaret's cough grew worse. But Elias tightened his grip. He told them it was trial, that the body could be denied so long as the spirit remained unbroken. And so they fasted, days without bread, water measured in thimbles, eyes sunken, voices cracked, yet the prayers grew louder. The hunger seemed only to sharpen them, until their words rattled the rafters, until the stone itself seemed to hum beneath the strain. And that's when he heard it. One servant, slipping away in the night, claimed he stopped at the edge of the clearing. Behind him, through the sealed windows, came a sound he could not forget. Not prayer, not song, but the noise of many voices straining together in one long note. He said it sounded less like worship and more like feeding. The story spread. The Wycliffe estate was no longer spoken of as holy, but as something consuming itself. Neighbors whispered of gaunt figures at the windows, of eyes glinting in the dark, unblinking, of voices still carrying on the air, though no one could tell where breath ended and echo began. The hunger had changed them. The rituals had sharpened into something harder, colder. And when one of the last servants returned to town, he gave a final, trembling account. Their prayers, he said, were not meant for God anymore. He refused to say who they were meant for. The record ends there. Abrupt, silent, but the manor still stood, shuttered, painted through with scripture that no rain could wash away. And beneath its stone, beneath the layers of voices pressed into the walls, something had begun to answer. The camera drifts slowly up the side of the manor. Shutters hang crooked. Paint peels into flakes that the wind does not move. It is 1861, for decades since the Wycliffe estate first rose from the stillness. And by then, the silence around it had hardened into a kind of warning. Few visitors came. Few neighbors approached. But inside, a new voice began to disturb the endless chorus. Her name was Mary, the youngest daughter, barely 12 years old. She had grown up in a house of prayer, a house where scripture was not spoken, but breathed, where silence was punished, and whispering was the rhythm of survival. But Mary broke the rhythm. She would not sleep. At first, it was only restlessness, turning in her bed, tears at the edges of her eyes, her lips still moving, whispering the verses she had been taught to repeat. But something wasn't right. By spring of that year, her whispers had changed. They were no longer steady. They were fractured, interrupted by gasps, by sudden cries in the dark. And then the screaming began, night after night. Her voice carried through the halls, not with words of prayer, but with terror. She told her parents the same thing each morning, that voices had stood beside her bed, that they whispered into her ear as she lay still. Her father silenced her, told her the house was blessed, that what she heard was holy, that she must not resist. But Mary wrote, in secret, by candle stub, in a small leather-bound journal she hid beneath her mattress. Those journals would not be found until decades later, when the house was finally unsealed. The pages were frantic, written in uneven hand, lines pressed so hard into the paper they nearly tore. Again and again, she wrote the same words. It isn't God listening. It is the house. Her handwriting grew more desperate with each entry, letters slanting, ink smeared where her hands shook. One page read, "They pray and pray, but they don't hear. Only the walls hear, and the walls want more." The voices she described were not her family's. She knew their cadences. She knew the tones of her brothers, the sigh of her mother, the steady low murmur of her father. These were different, lower, deeper, a sound like stone grinding against stone. Words stretched too far until syllables bent, and that's when she heard it. One night, she wrote, she awoke not to voices, but to silence, the kind of silence the house had never known. And then, all at once, a single word, spoken so close to her ear that she felt breath on her skin. Her candle went out. She did not relight it. From that night forward, Mary refused to sleep alone. She begged her mother to stay with her. She clutched her brother's hands until her knuckles whitened. But even then, the voices did not stop. One brother, Nathaniel, admitted years later that he heard them too. Not clearly, not fully, but in the rhythm of the house, in the faint vibration of the floorboards as he tried to comfort his sister. He said it was like being inside a throat. Every wall, every ceiling, every beam humming with a wordless chant. But Elias refused to listen. He told him the house was holy, that Mary's cries were temptation, that fear was the devil's last refuge. And so the rituals grew harder, the prayers louder, the days of fasting longer, while Mary grew thinner and paler, until her screams no longer carried to the halls, but broke off into hoarse sobs. Her last journal entries are nearly illegible, scrawls across pages that repeat the same warning. Not scripture, not psalms, but the sound of panic pressed into paper. The house listens. The house remembers. The house is not empty. The house is not empty. She underlined the last line 3 times. The ink bled through the page. After 1861, Mary Wycliffe disappears from the records. No burial date, no marriage record, no further mention in church rolls or county census. Only the journals remained, and in them one unfinished line, written in shaking hand. The last words before the page trails into nothing. It isn't God listening. The pen slips. The line stutters. It is the house. The camera drifts low across the valley. A pale mist lies heavy, clinging to the hedgerows and furrows. The earth seems cold, reluctant to wake. At the far end of the fields, the Wycliffe manor rises like a stone husk, its gables sharp, its windows shuttered, the chapel roof sagging beneath years of damp. It is the summer of 1873, and for the first time in living memory, the family is absent. The Wycliffes have been a fixture of the parish, not loved, not trusted, but always there. Each Sunday, their pew is filled. A line of pale faces beneath the stained glass. Children bowed. Elias Wycliffe at the front, chin held high, lips moving with the hymns, though his voice never rose above a whisper. Until, suddenly, they weren't. At first it was overlooked. The Wycliffes were private, withdrawn. A single absence could be explained by illness or weather or choice. No one thought much of it. But when weeks turned into months, unease set in. The clerk of the parish, Samuel Cross, was the first to speak openly. He noted their empty pew in his record book with a frown. He mentioned it to the rector in passing. And though the matter was brushed aside, something in him grew restless, because the Wycliffes did not miss services. They did not neglect appearances. Their devotion was strange, rigid but consistent. And now, without warning, the pattern had broken. Whispers began at the market. Women folding cloth at their stalls murmured that perhaps the family had left. Men weighing grain said perhaps the children had taken ill. But why no word? Why no carriage seen leaving the night? Why no smoke from the chimneys? By midsummer, the silence could no longer be ignored. So a group resolved to go to the manor. It was a small party. Thomas Gray, a farmer with fields bordering the Wycliffe land. Samuel Cross, driven by his record book and conscience. Margaret Allen, who insisted on joining to search for children. And 2 others who volunteered reluctantly, armed with lanterns. The path was overgrown. Weeds clawed at their boots. The ruts where carriage wheels had once passed were thick with nettles. The closer they came, the more the air seemed to resist. The hedgerows pressed inward. The sky darkened though no storm was near. The gate hung crooked, iron twisted and rusted. No hand had touched it in months. They pushed through and entered the courtyard. The garden was wild, roses long dead, grass waist high, the fountain dry, its basin littered with brittle leaves. And the manor itself loomed above them, every shutter sealed, every door shut tight. It did not look abandoned. It looked waiting. They knocked. Their fists against the oak rang hollow, echoing into the house beyond. They waited. No answer. Thomas pressed closer and frowned. The doors were barred. not from outside, as if to keep intruders away, but from within. The iron bolts were drawn across the frame. The house had locked itself. A chill passed through them. To leave the house, one must draw back the bolts. No one could have left without undoing them. And yet, the family was gone. Reluctantly, they pried at the wood. Metal shrieked. Oak split. With each pull, dust rained down from the frame. At last the doors gave way, and a smell drifted into the courtyard. Not the sharp stench of decay. Not flesh, not blood, but food, long abandoned. Bread turned sour. Meat gray and furred with mold. A smell that clung to the tongue, sweet and foul at once. Lanterns lifted. They stepped inside. The air was heavy. Curtains drawn tight against the sun. Dust hung in slow spirals, thick enough to choke. The kitchen told the first story. Plates set out on the table. Cups half filled with water, now ringed with green. Bread cut, but never eaten. A joint of lamb still resting on a platter, crawling with worms. The chairs were pushed back, not neatly, not tucked, but as if left in haste. As if each place had been abandoned in mid-meal. Margaret gasped and covered her mouth. Samuel wrote in his ledger with shaking hand. Table set. Food rotting. No family present. And that's when they understood. The Wycliffes had vanished. Room by room, they searched. The drawing room, curtains heavy with mildew. The study, books stacked neatly, a quill still resting in an inkwell. The ink dried to crust. The bedrooms, beds unmade, clothes still folded in drawers. Children's shoes lined the foot of their beds. Dolls sitting upright, staring into the dark. But no children, no footsteps, no sign of struggle. It was as if the family had stood up from the table, walked into the shadows, and dissolved. The silence of the house pressed on them. Every floorboard creaked like a sigh. Every door groaned as though resisting their entry. And yet, there was no violence here. No chaos, only absence. In the chapel, the air grew colder. The altar cloth was stained with wax. A single candle stub had burned itself to nothing, melted into the stone floor. Hymnals lay scattered on the pews, as though dropped mid-song. But no footprints, no voices, nothing. Thomas swore he felt a draft, not from the broken windows, but from beneath the floorboards, a breath rising upward, though no passage was found. The search stretched into evening. Lantern light flickered across dust and webs. Each room told the same story. Abandonment, but not departure. By nightfall, they gathered in the courtyard once more. The house loomed behind them, its windows black, its roof line sharp against the moon. They barred the doors again, as if sealing it shut could contain what they had seen. And they returned to the village with no answers. But something was not finished. That night, just before dawn, a sound carried across the valley. The bell, the chapel bell. It rang once, then again, slow, measured, as though a hand pulled the rope with deliberate care. Each toll spread across the hills, low, metallic, drawing the cattle from their pens, stirring birds from the trees. Villagers rose from their beds, drawn to their windows. They saw no light in the manor, no figure in the belfry, but the bell rang on. Thomas claimed he counted 32 strikes before it ceased. Margaret swore it was fewer, but all agreed on one thing. The sound did not fade as a bell should. It lingered long after the last toll, as if the valley itself had taken up the sound. And when at last it ended, silence crashed down heavier than before. The following morning, men returned to the chapel. They climbed the narrow stairs to the belfry. The rope lay coiled, untouched, the knot stiff with disuse. No sign that it had been moved, no prints in the dust. And yet, each man swore he still felt the vibration in his bones, as though the sound had not ended, but settled inside them. From that day forward, the Wycliffe manor was abandoned. No villager dared approach. No servant returned. The family was never found. Children whispered of the empty pew in church. Farmers avoided the fields that bordered the estate. And each dawn, when the valley lay silent, they strained their ears, waiting, because Once you heard the bell, you could not forget it. It was not just sound. It was a reminder of a table left set, of chairs pushed back, of a family that had vanished without a trace, and of a house that waited still. But the question remained. What could draw a family from their table without leaving a trail? What hand could ring a bell when no hand was there? And why did the villagers feel, even years later, that the sound was not finished, that it was still echoing just beneath the silence? The camera drifts across the husk of the manor. Its windows are black. Its walls sag beneath ivy. The door hangs slightly ajar, as though expecting another visitor. Inside, the air is thick with damp stone and the silence of rooms too long abandoned. But the silence is never complete, because those who entered claimed it was not empty at all. They said they heard prayers, not sung from a congregation, not whispered from lips, but breathed from the walls themselves. For nearly 50 years after the disappearance of the Wycliffe family, the house became a subject of fascination. Scholars, priests, skeptics, and wanderers came in waves. Some traveled from nearby parishes. Others arrived from cities miles away. Each left a record. Each wrote about what they thought they found here. But their accounts all contained the same line. It prayed to itself. At first, the historians tried to ground the mystery in reason. They noted the architecture of the chapel wing. Vaulted ceilings, hidden chambers, air pockets behind plaster. Old wood and hollow stone could bend the wind, producing strange harmonics that, they argued, could explain the murmuring. But something wasn't right, because the words were clear. Those who stayed long enough could make them out. Phrases from scripture, psalms and invocations, sometimes Latin, sometimes English, always in rhythm, always in cadence. One priest, Father Armitage, visited in 1887. He kept a small journal. By the second night, he wrote, "I hear the litany. It does not cease when I pray. It does not falter when I sing aloud. It joins with me, as if finishing what I have not yet spoken." The handwriting grew erratic in the pages that followed. One entry ends mid-sentence, and if it prays without the faithful, then the line trails off. He left the manor the next morning. Another visitor, a historian named George Whitlock, scoffed at such claims. In his letters, he argued that the manor was simply haunted by reputation, not by spirit. That fear could bend perception, that the mind could invent voices in silence. But then he too described something different. He said he could feel the rhythm. The prayers seemed to pulse beneath his feet, like the thrum of a hidden organ. And that's when he heard it. Whitlock swore that one night, as he slept in the drawing room, the voice did not come from the walls. It came from right beside him. He wrote that it spoke his name. By dawn, he was gone. His belongings were left behind. His tent collapsed in the garden, his horse untethered. No one saw him again. Other skeptics tried to measure it. They carried tuning forks, barometers, early recording devices. But when they played the cylinders back, there was nothing. No voices, no rhythm, only silence. The absence frightened them more than proof ever could, because those who were present swore they had heard it, swore they had felt it. But on wax, nothing remained. One occultist, visiting in 1901, declared the manor was not haunted at all. His interpretation was far darker. The family is not here, but their devotion is. He believed prayer had etched itself into the very structure, that decades of fasting, recitation, and ritual had cut grooves into stone deeper than any chisel. Not memory, not haunting, but repetition. The prayers continued without mouths to form them, without souls to guide them. The house had learned to pray. This conclusion unsettled even other occultists, because if true, it meant the manor did not need people. It meant faith itself had taken root, not as spirit, but as echo, something between belief and stone, something living. Through the early decades of the 20th century, the manor became both pilgrimage and warning. Young seminarians dared each other to enter. Parish council forbade it. Still, stories spread. A boy claimed he stood in the nave one afternoon and heard the prayers rise in unison with his own heartbeat. A woman said the cadence quickened when she tried to leave, as if the house did not want to go. But the most disturbing account came in 1923. A scholar named Henry Moore, respected for his work on religious architecture, visited alone. He stayed 3 nights. On the 4th, he was found in the nearby inn, pale and trembling. He refused to sleep indoors ever again. His papers were left behind. Inside, one note repeated across several pages. It is not answering. It is asking. It is asking without end. Moore withdrew from public life after that. His family claimed he suffered a nervous collapse. But his final words, spoken to his son, were preserved. Do not go back to the manor. The prayers are not meant for us. The records began to thin after the 1930s. The manor decayed further. Its roof caved in places. The chapel doors rotted from their hinges. Yet still, wanderers who braved the halls reported the same sound. It did not fade. If anything, it grew steadier. No longer whispers, but a low, ceaseless murmur, filling the corridors like water through pipes. Some believed it was madness, the house-inspiring delusion, but others believed something else, that it was worship. And if worship could continue without worshipers, then perhaps faith was never about God at all. Perhaps it was about walls, stone, and memory. The accounts differ in tone, in detail, in fear, but they converge on a single chilling certainty. The house did not forget the family. It did not forget the prayers. It did not forget devotion. Even now, on damp nights, travelers crossing the fields near the estate speak of faint voices, a cadence carried low by the wind. No congregation remains, no priest, no children, and yet, still, the house prays. But the question remains, praying to whom? Praying for what? Or worse, praying for someone to answer. And the next visitor who enters its halls may discover the truth, because the prayers are still waiting. Round pushpin word count, 2:355. The camera drifts slowly through winter air. A gray sky, black trees without leaves, and through them, just visible, the shape of Wycliffe Manor. Silent, weather-beaten, windows like empty eyes. The year was 1946. The war had ended, but for many men who returned, it had not truly ended at all. One of them was Private Daniel Mercer, a veteran, 31 years old, stationed overseas in Europe, decorated for bravery, but carrying something he never spoke aloud. Locals remembered him as a man who walked quickly, but always looked over his shoulder. He rented a room in a boarding house 2 towns over, paid in cash, drank little, slept less, and kept a small leather Bible by his bed, though no one ever saw him read it. He told the landlady once, just once, that he was looking for a place where God could hear him, but she never forgot the way he said it. Not a church, not a priest, a place. And that place, in February of that year, was the abandoned Wycliffe estate. For reasons no one would fully explain, Mercer left his room late one night, walked the 3 miles on foot, climbed the rusted gates, and broke into the manor house. The sound of glass shattering woke a neighbor across the fields. They assumed it was a storm. It wasn't. By the time the sheriff was alerted, the trail had already gone cold. For 3 days, no one saw him. His belongings sat untouched in the rooming house. His uniform folded in the wardrobe. His Bible left open, not to a psalm, but to a blank flyleaf. On it, only his name, written twice, once firm, once scrawled. Then, on the morning of the 4th day, he was seen again. A farmer walking near the woods east of the manor heard a man's voice, low, muttering. When he looked closer, he found Mercer staggering between the trees, his boots gone, his shirt torn, his skin pale as ash, and his lips moving, over and over. I confessed, I confessed, I confessed. He collapsed before the farmer reached him. When the sheriff carried him back to town, Mercer was half conscious, eyes open but unfocused. Whenever asked what happened inside the manor, he gave the same reply, I confess, to the house itself. Doctors at the county infirmary noted his condition, malnourished, hypothermic, but no sign of injury. He was placed in bed, and a nurse wrote that he spent the entire night speaking. Not crying, not shouting, just speaking, as if reciting a litany only he could hear. But something wasn't right. When staff tried to listen, they realized he wasn't speaking English anymore. The words were broken fragments, Latin phrases half remembered, the language of confession, but not spoken to a priest, not spoken to God, spoken, as he said, to the house. A priest was called from a nearby parish. He met Mercer at his bedside, asked him plainly what he meant. Mercer's eyes cleared for just a moment. His voice grew steady. "It knows what I did overseas," he whispered. "It forgave me, but it wasn't God." No one wrote down what sins he confessed. Not the priest, not the doctors, not even the sheriff, who sat by his bed that night. They said it was the kind of thing a man carries alone, the kind of thing that rots if ever spoken. But the records show this. After that night, Mercer never left the infirmary. He was committed to the state sanitarium in June. His mind gone, his body thin, and within 6 months, he was dead. The official cause, exhaustion of the nervous system. But among the staff, there was another phrase used quietly, devotion collapse. One nurse, years later, described it. He looked like a man who had been prayed to death. Only no one was in the room with him. And yet there was, because the farmer who had found him said that when Mercer first stumbled from the woods, there had been something else, a sound he would never forget, faint, hollow, carried on the cold air between the trees, as if the walls of the manor themselves had exhaled, a low murmur, like voices reciting a prayer. And that's when he heard it. Not one voice, but many, each perfectly aligned, each speaking in rhythm, the rhythm of confession. The farmer did not go near the manor again. He sold his land within a year. He told his children, and his children told theirs, stay away from the woods after dark, because the house had listened once, and it might listen again. Mercer's body was buried in a quiet cemetery without military honors. No one claimed him. His grave remains unmarked, but his words, his final words, were recorded in the sanitarium's files, words that the staff refused to read aloud, even in training. It knows what I did. It forgave me, but it wasn't God. And those who worked at the sanitarium swore that, in the days after his death, something strange happened. At night, in the long corridors, prayers seemed to echo faintly, not from the chapel, not from the patients, from the walls themselves. When asked what they sounded like, one orderly gave the only description he could, like the manor had followed him here. The camera lingers, pulling back from the sanitarium's decayed brick facade, the windows dark, the doors chained shut, and the silence holding just long enough for a voice to slip through, whispering, soft, steady, as if still listening, still forgiving, but not in God's name. The camera drifts slowly toward the house. Its walls are weathered, leaning, yet stubbornly standing. The pane is cracked, the shutters broken, the roof slouched under decades of neglect. Around it, the trees bend in uneven shapes, their branches clawing toward the windows as if trying to reach inside. The wind moves through the high grass with a hush. Not silence, not sound, something between. By the 1970s, the Wycliffe house had become more than a ruin. It was a rumor. Whispers of what had been heard inside, whispers of what had been found in the chapel's walls, whispers of men who entered and came out changed. These were no longer the talk of neighbors. They had spread into newspapers, into late-night radio, into the mouths of men who wanted proof of things unseen. Paranormal investigators came. They brought their cameras, their recorders, their charts, their meters, their carefully rehearsed skepticism, and they left with something else. Tapes that hissed with voices no one remembered speaking. Photographs where shadows stood where no body had been. Journals where sentences trailed off mid-thought, as if the hand holding the pen had refused to go further. The state noticed the town had tolerated decades of rumor, but not tourists, not investigators slipping through fences and bribing caretakers for entry. not teenagers daring each other to step across the threshold and vanishing for hours. And so, in 1974, it was decided the Wycliffe house would be sealed, not demolished. That word was avoided. To strike the house down, some argued, would be to stir it, to scatter its story in the air like ash. No, they said, better to close it, to nail it shut, to let it suffocate in its own silence. But silence did not come. The men who closed it told a different story. They were workers, state-hired, ordinary men who had built fences, repaired barns, shuttered dozens of condemned homes across the county. They had no stake in rumor. They wanted their day's wage and nothing more. And yet, each one spoke the same thing, that the house would not stay quiet. It began the moment they stepped onto the porch. The wood bow beneath their boots, the air dry with dust and rot. And then just faintly, as if from a radio playing behind a wall, they heard voices, soft, murmuring, like prayer. At first, they thought it was the wind, a draft moving through the open windows. But when they entered, the sound grew clearer. It was rhythmic, deliberate, a pattern of words. Not loud enough to understand, but steady enough to recognize. And it was coming from the walls. One man, Harold Price, paused his hammer mid-swing. He pressed his ear against the plaster, half mocking, half curious. And he swore, later, in testimony he gave off record, that he could hear a single phrase repeated, over and over, a blessing, but not one he had ever been taught in church. Another worker, Raymond Cole, remembered it differently. To him, the words were not words at all. They were sound without language, a low drone, like many mouths moving at once just beyond comprehension. But they all agreed on one thing. It was not silence. It was prayer. The first windows were boarded with little trouble. Nails driven. Would cut. The sound continued. But something wasn't right. The closer they sealed the house, the clearer the prayers became. One described it as if the voices were being pressed outward, squeezed against the wood as the light was shut out. By the third window, several of the men refused to keep going inside. They waited on the porch, shifting uncomfortably, chain-smoking cigarettes while their foreman barked orders. They claimed they felt watched, not from the rooms, but from the very walls around them. And that's when he heard it. One of the younger men, barely 20, dropped his hammer and ran outside, pale and shaking. He said the wall had whispered his name, not shouted, not spoken, just whispered, a low murmur, familiar, like a voice that knew him. The others laughed at him then, nervous laughter, the kind that needs to exist, or else silence will crush the lungs. But later, each of them admitted something similar had happened, a phrase that bent toward recognition, a syllable that sounded like family, a prayer that knew who was listening. Still, the work continued. The state paid them by the day. They had no choice but to finish. By the time the last window was reached, the prayers had swelled. One described it as a church congregation breathing through the walls. Another called it a throat without a body. But all of them knew what it felt like. A house that did not want to be closed. The final nail was driven just as the sun was setting. The wood, splintered and uneven, sealed the last shaft of light from the parlor. And then it stopped. The murmurs, the prayers, the drone, all of it, silence, heavy as stone, filled the house. The men froze. No one moved. No one spoke. For the first time that day, they believed it was finished, that the whispers had been pushed back into darkness where they belonged. But silence was not comfort. The silence itself felt wrong. Several workers said later that it was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something else, something waiting. One man swore he could still feel the vibration of the voices, even when they had ceased. Another claimed the air itself felt different, thicker, as though the prayers had not ended but had sunk beneath the surface, like embers waiting to flare. And so they left. The house stood, shuttered, its windows blind, the locks fixed, the nails in place, the job done. But each of the men who worked that day carried something away with them. Price never entered a church again. He told his wife that the prayers he had heard in the walls followed him into the pews. that every blessing spoken from the pulpit sounded wrong, like an imitation of what the house had murmured. Cole began drinking heavily. He told friends that when he lay in bed at night, the rhythm returned, faint, distant, but steady, like a heartbeat pressed against his skull. The young man who heard his name left town altogether. His family never saw him again, and the foreman, silent during the job, determined to keep men working, was found months later wandering the fields behind the estate. He had been drinking, talking to himself, saying prayers no one recognized. When asked what he was repeating, he said only, "It's theirs, not mine." The state closed the files. The reports were never made public. What mattered was the house was sealed. But locals knew better. They said if you walked past it at dusk, you could still hear it. Not loud, not clear, but there, a pressure in the air, like prayer trying to escape. Some called it haunting. Others called it history, refusing to die. But those who had been inside, those who had placed the nails and boarded the windows, said it was something else entirely. Not haunting, not memory, something still alive. And though the house was sealed, it was not silent. It had only learned how to listen. The scream begins in darkness, a faint hiss of static. Then, slowly, an image pulls into focus. A house, weathered and sunken into the earth, its windows like hollow sockets. The camera edges closer, unsteady, carried in the trembling hands of young explorers who had come not for prayer, not for answers, but for spectacle. The Wycliffe house, sealed for decades, whispered about for generations. And yet tonight, it waits. The footage begins with laughter, nervous, hollow, the kind of laughter that fills the gaps where courage should be. A group of 4 urban explorers. Their names barely matter. What they carried with them mattered more. Flashlights, phones, a live stream link that drew strangers across the world into a house that did not want to be forgotten. They speak over one another, jokes about ghosts, dares about who will step inside first. Their voices echo unnaturally, as though the night itself is pushing the sound back toward them. But something wasn't right. The air is still, too still, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but crowded, as though silence itself had weight. The lead explorer pushes the door open. The wood moans on its hinges. Dust rolls forward like smoke disturbed from an old censer. The house breathes them in. They step into the entryway, and at first, all seems as expected. The live chat scrolls with comments. Looks fake. Yo, this is creepy AF. Someone's behind you, LL. But the explorers are oblivious. They aim their flashlights at the staircase, at the crumbling wallpaper, at the corners where cobwebs knot together. Their voices rise, masking nerves with false bravado. Then it happens. The live feed audio dips, distorts. For a split second, the chat freezes, and in that sliver of silence, too faint for the explorers to notice, but clear for every viewer at home, comes a voice. A whisper. It speaks a name. Not just any name. One of theirs. The chat erupts. Did you hear that? It said Jason. Play it back, play it back. But the explorers keep moving, unaware. Their boots crunch glass along the hallway. Their laughter grows thinner. They keep checking the stream, asking their viewers if the feed is stable. They don't know that the stream has already betrayed them. And that's when he heard it. Jason, not through the phone, not in his headphones, but with his own ears. The sound did not echo. It did not drift. It came directly behind him, warm, intimate, like a breath against the back of his neck. He freezes, swings his flashlight. Nothing. The others laugh at his sudden silence. They think he's staging a moment for the audience. But his face drains of color. His lips twitch. His jaw works as though he wants to speak, but doesn't trust his own voice. "Don't say my name," he mutters, almost to himself. The others fall quiet, but the house is not quiet, because now it speaks again. Another name. This time, the girl holding the secondary camera. Her name, whispered with perfect clarity, sliding out of the cracked plaster walls. She drops the camera. The feed tilts sideways. The ceiling beams come into view. The sound distorts again, like water filling the microphone. Viewers type frantically. I heard it too. Stop playing around. Get out of the house. But the explorers don't leave. Instead, curiosity presses them deeper, like moths that mistake firelight for safety. The footage cuts to the living room. The explorers circle around what was once a fireplace. Empty, bricked up long ago. One of them says it looks like an altar. Another laughs nervously, but his voice cracks halfway through. The feed grows unstable. Flickers. Every time the camera adjusts focus, the wallpaper seems to ripple. Not visibly, not violently, just enough to suggest that the walls themselves are moving, breathing, and in the breath, another prayer, low, continuous. A prayer not in English, not in Latin, something older, something that doesn't belong to the mouths of men. The explorers hear it now, all of them. Their laughter dies completely. The girl whispers, "Are you guys doing that?" No one answers. They all look at one another. The live chat scrolls faster. Bro, this is real. I can hear it too. It's praying? The prayers do not stop. And with each whispered word, the explorers grow paler, their movements slower. They clutch their phones tighter, as if the glowing screens could protect them. But something wasn't right, because the house wasn't repeating prayers in random cadence. It was calling them, one by one, each name, each whispered syllable. The explorers retreat. They stumble toward the door. Their flashlights beam wildly, cutting through dust that looks like smoke from a ritual long extinguished. Their voices grow frantic, overlapping with the rush of viewers begging them to leave. But the house doesn't let them. Every doorway seems narrower, every hall longer. Each step echoes louder than the last. One boy turns his head toward the window, desperate for proof of the outside world. What he sees drains him of all color. The glass. It's not reflecting him. It's reflecting someone kneeling, praying, someone with his face. The feed jolts, cuts, static bursts across the screen. For a moment, nothing but snow. Then, a final image, the house itself. From the outside, silent, still, except for one impossible detail. The walls, the shutters, the frame of the building, all of it rising and falling, not collapsing, not swaying with wind, breathing like a living thing, breathing like lungs exhaling prayer into the night. The feed dies. Hours later, police recover the cameras. They report no trace of the explorers inside, no footprints, no signs of forced exit, only equipment, only silence. But when they play back the footage, they all hear it. Not the laughter, not the footsteps, not even the panic. Only the house, praying. And though none of the officers ever admitted it publicly, at least one swore he heard his own name whispered back. That was the last recording. And the Wycliffe house still stands, waiting, breathing, praying alone. The Wycliffes built their home to echo their devotion. But in the end, it was not God who answered. It was the house. And the house has never stopped. Perhaps some prayers should never be spoken, because something else may be listening.